Now that we have our fully rendered sequence, we need to go ahead and export it. Exporting is the process of taking elements from within our timeline and saving it out into one singular file, which can be viewed on various media players. To do this, the first thing I want to do is inform Premiere as to which part of the sequence I actually want to export. The way I do this is by setting what are called in and out points. They're simple to set. I'm going to go ahead and bring my playhead to the very beginning of the timeline. Remember that you can also use your up and down arrow keys in order to reach specific points within your sequence. Once there, I'm going to go ahead and set my in point. To do this, I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcut I. If for whatever reason you forget what the keyboard shortcut is for in, underneath your preview window, you'll see that there are a couple of different buttons that you can press. Two of them look like brackets. These are also ways that you can set an in and an out, and they both say what the keyboard shortcut is if you hover over them. Now that I've gone ahead and created my in point, I now need to make an out point. For my purposes, I'm actually not going to export our graphic that we rendered earlier. Instead, I only want to export this clip called nature. So I'm going to go ahead and use my down arrow key in order to reach the end of nature, and I'm going to go ahead and press the letter O to set an out point. Again, you can use the bracket buttons up above if you prefer. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to point out a few things that you should pay attention to whenever you're exporting from Premiere. Let's talk about the length that this sequence is. With the inclusion of the graphic that we were working with in our last video, this entire sequence is 2 minutes and 8 seconds. I can tell because my playhead is at the very end of this sequence, and that's where my timecode is informing me it is. But right now, I have my in-out point set to just 2 minutes. I can tell that because in the lower right-hand corner of the preview window, I can see what my in and out duration is. If I get rid of my in-out points by pressing Option X on a Mac, I'll now just get my full sequence length. Be sure to pay attention to these numbers when you're exporting. I'll show you why in a moment. Now that we have our in and out points set, let's go ahead and begin the process of exporting. To do this, go up to File, go to Export, and for our purposes, we're going to be using Export Media. As you can see, there are several other options we can use as well. Some of them, such as Final Cut and Avid Log Exchange, will allow us to export into other editing programs if we're working with fellow editors who may be working on different equipment. OMF and AAF have to do with exporting for audio, but for us, we're going to just go ahead and press Export Media. Once we press Export Media, we should end up with a pop-up that looks like this. Now, a few moments ago, I was mentioning to you to pay attention to what those timecodes were telling us. I had my timecode set for 2 minutes and 1 millisecond. I can tell if I'm exporting the correct section of my sequence because I can see that same timecode written right here in the lower right-hand corner of this left panel. And down below this, I can see that my source range is my sequence in and out point. It's really important that you pay attention to this because otherwise you could end up accidentally exporting things further along in your timeline that you may have forgotten were placed there. I've had it happen before where students will export what they think is only a few minute sequence but accidentally be exporting over an hours long sequence because they forgot that something was further along in their timeline and they forgot to set their in-out points. If, however, I changed my mind and decided I wanted to export my entire timeline, I can do that easily by changing my source range. Right now it's set just to sequence in out. Instead, I could change it to entire sequence. And now I'm exporting everything, including my graphic at the end. And if I want, I can just drag through using this smaller playhead and make sure that everything looks the way that I want it to. You can also set your in-out points from the export window as well, using these two buttons right here. If I decide that instead of opening on this beginning shot, I want to open instead on this footage of a snake, I can just press this in point. I could move along further and determine I want to end at this turtle footage. And now I've set a new out for myself. And now instead of the full 2 minutes and 8 seconds that I was originally going to export, I'll now only export 53 seconds. These are all options that you have when exporting. Now that we've talked a little bit about this left side panel, let's talk about everything that we have over to the right here. The first being format. In general, for the purposes of this class, we're going to be exporting with this format, H.264. This is a really good format for using whenever you're uploading to the internet because it's a small file size, but it's still a fairly good quality. This is not, however, what you would want to export at if you were trying to put something up, say, on a big screen in a movie theater. Instead, for that, you would use something like an AIFF. All of these formats offer their own benefits and drawbacks, but for the most part, H.264 is the only one we'll be using for this class. Below that, we have our preset. Our preset allows us to further specify how we want to go ahead and save this. If I click on it, you'll see that I have a lot of different options. In fact, if I scroll down, you'll notice that there are actually options to export specifically to certain video sharing sites, such as Vimeo and YouTube. If you knew that you were going to be making videos exclusively for YouTube, you could actually scroll down and select the YouTube option, and whichever different size you want. 1080p is the one that I usually use for these videos. These presets will be different depending on what format you pick. If I picked QuickTime, for example, my options are completely different. For the purpose of our class, though, you'll be exporting at match source high bitrate. The next thing that we need to do is determine what we're calling our export and where we're saving it. And we can do that with the output name. As I've mentioned in previous videos, just about anything in blue can be edited, so if you want to change where you're saving to, go ahead and just click on what your current output name is. I'm currently saving this to a file that I just have titled as my name, and I'm just going to call this Learn to Export, and I'm going to hit save. Below this, you can see that we have some options as far as if we want to export our video and our audio, or only one or the other. If you choose that you only want your audio, you just click off video, and same the other way around. Now down below here we have some further options on how we can customize our export. For our class we're going to mostly leave these as is, but I do want to point out a couple of things, namely the basic video settings. This allows me to see how large my actual video frame is and what the frame rate is that it's running at. Right now my video will be a size of 1280p by 720p and it's running at a frame rate of 29.97 frames per second. The last thing I want to point out to you is this option called Publish. If you determine that you want to start posting things online to sites such as Vimeo and YouTube, you can actually do it directly from Premiere. If I scroll down, you'll see that I have various options such as Twitter, Vimeo, and down here I have YouTube. If I wanted to go ahead and post this video directly to YouTube, all I would have to do is check the box next to it, plug in my sign-in information, say what channel it belongs to, if there's a playlist that I want it to go into, and then I'll title it, give it a description, determine the privacy settings, tag it, and choose if I want a custom thumbnail or not. I use this pretty frequently when posting these videos online, and it saves me a lot of time in the long run. Now, once we've run through all of these settings, the last thing that we need to do is determine if we want to export immediately or if we want to queue it up in the Adobe Media Encoder. If you are exporting multiple files, such as several small clips or multiple videos all at once, we would go ahead and press Q, which will then open up the Adobe Media Encoder, which is a secondary application that works sidelong with Premiere. If we elect to queue up our export rather than exporting immediately, we'll end up with a frame that looks like this. This is the Adobe Media Encoder. Once we have everything that we want to export lined up, all you have to do is hit this play button in the upper right-hand corner, and then it'll immediately start to export for you. Again, if you have several things that you're trying to export at once, this is a great way to go about it rather than exporting several times throughout the day. If instead we want to export immediately, we'll just go to File, Export Media, check all of our settings, mine are all the way I want them to be, and then just hit Export. And now it's being exported directly from the program. And just like that, my export is done. Once the export is finished, we just open up our final video. For the settings we have it set to, it'll be exporting as an MP4. We play it through to make sure it looks the way we want it to. In the next video, we'll be going over how to change preferences in Adobe Premiere.